Great Gold Confiscation of 1933. The seizure of gold by the U.S. government is commonly associated with a series of events that took place during the 1930s. This period is known as the Great Gold Confiscation or the Gold Recall. The main event in this regard was the issuance of Executive Order 6102 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 5, 1933. This order effectively prohibited the hoarding of gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates by individuals, trusts, and corporations in the United States. The reasons behind this action were multifaceted. Economic stability. The U.S. was in the midst of the Great Depression, and President Roosevelt's administration was seeking ways to stabilize the economy. The government believed that by controlling the circulation and possession of gold, it could prevent hoarding and promote economic recovery. Monetary policy. The U.S. was still on the gold standard at the time, which meant that the value of the U.S. dollar was tied to a specific quantity of gold. To combat deflation and stimulate economic growth, the government wanted to increase the money supply, and it believed that allowing people to hoard gold would hinder this goal. Currency confidence. With banks failing and the financial system in turmoil, there were concerns about a potential run on the banks and a loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar. By taking control of gold, the government aimed to strengthen confidence in the currency. Under Executive Order 6102, individuals were required to deliver their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to Federal Reserve banks in exchange for U.S. dollars at the prevailing rate of $20.67 per troy ounce of gold. There were exceptions for jewelry and collectors' coins. Violations of the order were subject to fines and even imprisonment. This action effectively nationalized the ownership of gold and centralized it within the U.S. government. The gold collected from individuals was stored in Fort Knox and other government vaults. The gold standard was eventually abandoned in 1971 by President Richard Nixon, which marked the end of the link between the U.S. dollar and a specific amount of gold. It's worth noting that this seizure of gold was a specific response to the economic and financial challenges of the Great Depression era, and it was enacted under extraordinary circumstances. While it remains a significant event in U.S. economic history, it's also important to understand the context in which it occurred. The gold that was seized by the U.S. government through Executive Order 6102 in 1933 was primarily held by the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve banks. The government's intention was to consolidate control over the nation's gold reserves as part of its efforts to address the economic challenges of the Great Depression. After the gold was collected from individuals, it was stored in various locations, including the U.S. Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and other secure facilities. The government maintained ownership of this gold and used it to back the U.S. dollar and the currency system. Over the years, the gold holdings played a role in the stability of the U.S. dollar and the country's monetary policy. The gold standard, which tied the value of the U.S. dollar to a specific amount of gold, was maintained for some time after the confiscation, although its connection to gold was gradually weakened. The gold remained under government control for several decades. In the early 1970s, under President Richard Nixon's administration, the U.S. officially ended the gold standard, effectively disconnecting the U.S. dollar from a fixed amount of gold. This move was known as the Nixon shock and marked a significant shift in the global monetary system. Subsequently, the U.S. continued to hold its gold reserves, although they were no longer directly tied to the value of the U.S. dollar. The gold holdings were considered part of the country's overall reserves, which also included foreign currency reserves and other assets. Today, the U.S. government still holds substantial gold reserves, but these reserves are not actively used to back the U.S. dollar's value in the way they were during the gold standard era. Instead, the gold reserves serve as a store of value and a potential asset in times of economic uncertainty. In summary, the gold seized by the U.S. government in 1933 was used to consolidate control over the nation's gold reserves and support the monetary system of the time. While the gold standard era ended in the 1970s, the U.S. continues to hold gold reserves as part of its overall asset holdings,